Hey guys, today we'll be looking at the week 4 material. Last week we went over just a macroscopic bird's eye view of the abdomen, right? Looking at major structures like the stomach, the liver, and then looking at major structures like greater omentum, smaller omentum, stomach. Like we're looking at the structures that are on a macroscopic view. Now we're going to start moving in more into the fine details of the abdomen, looking at the nerves, kidneys, muscles, and ducts, as well as the vasculature that's in the posterior, right? So we're looking more at the anterior. Now we're going to looking deeper in the posterior of the abdominal cavity. So we're going to start with the arteries. So get your content sheets out. I do want to remind you guys that these videos that I'm making are meant to be a supplement to what you're learning in lab, lecture, and office hours. This is not meant to replace any of those. This is made to solidify and make that knowledge that you learn in those areas and those places more foundational, right? It's not meant to replace them and use this video or the videos that I make as a complete replacement. It's not meant for that. Also, I would urge you guys to to read over the pre-labs over and over. I do think that the pre-labs are a great resource, as well as do the post-labs. But in saying that and concluding with that, we can move on to the week 4 content list. So as you can see with, making a mistake here. All right, here we go. As you can see with this 3D rendering, it looks a little bit complicated, but we're going to go one by one through it. Make sure you guys can see and understand the different structures for this week's review. So let me just zoom in a little bit. Okay, so the first thing we're starting off is with the aorta. So if I press on the aorta, right, descending thoracic aorta, we have the abdominal aorta. Now I'm going to select multiple. Right, so I'm going to do that. So this is our aorta. If I were to press examine, right, big artery, right, going through the thorax and the abdominal region, right. This is something we're very familiar with. Now, if I remove examine, we're going to move on into the first branch of CSI, or the first section of CSI, right? So CSI would be celiac trunk, superior mesenteric artery for S, and inferior mesenteric artery for I. So if I were to look for the celiac trunk, it needs to be the most superior region, right, of the CSI, right? So that would be the celiac trunk right there. So if I press the celiac trunk, if I press all of its branches, right, we see it as 3 branches. So imagine putting your finger up, right? Imagine putting your pointer finger up and then taking your other hand, right? So one hand has the pointer finger, your other hand just has 3 fingers out pointed in the same direction. If I were to put my pointer finger to the back of my hand, of the 3 fingers that are pointing out in the same direction, that could get you a 3D representation, right, of the celiac trunk coming from the aorta, right? And then there's branches from that. So if I put examine here, right, we can see the 3 branches, right? So our first branch is the common hepatic artery. Our second branch is the splenic artery, and then our third branch is the left gastric artery, right? So left gastric, common hepatic, and splenic. Left gastric, common hepatic, splenic. These are all the branches of the celiac trunk. And the reason why it's saying different names is because I'm just an examine and I'm not an inspect. So if I was an inspect, you would only see common hepatic artery, left gastric artery, and you would see splenic artery. Alright, so now we know that there's 3 branches of the celiac trunk. One way I can differentiate one of these arteries, left gastric artery, is that when you're looking in the actual donors, the left gastric artery is a lot smaller than the common hepatic and splenic. Also, it looks a little bit stringy and spaghetti-like, kind of being coiled, right? And the reason for that is that the stomach is expanding and contracting as food is going inside of it, right? So our stomach is getting bigger, it's getting smaller, right? So once food is entering into the pyloric sphincter and then through the duodenum, the jejunum and ileum, right? The food is leaving the stomach, right? And the stomach isn't going to be as big as when you're extremely full because the food is leaving the stomach, right? So that artery needs to be able to move the stomach as it gets bigger and larger and as food is moving through the digestional tract. So that's why that artery is string-like, and that's how you can differentiate it from common hepatic and the splenic artery. So that being said, we're going to move on to the second branch of the CSI, being the S. So superior mesenteric artery. Right, it's right there. If I press inspect, right, all right, C, S, superior mesenteric artery, and then we have I. I would be right here, inferior mesenteric artery. So I just want us to go and examine here, inspect actually, and you can see how the C is the most superior branch, whereas the inferior one is the most inferior, and that makes sense because inferior mesenteric artery, and it's going to the mesenteries of the digestional tract. All right, so you know in anatomy, these names they directly tell or represent what they're either functioning to do or what they're nearby. Saying that, so now that we have those, we're going to move on to the iliacs. So the next branch, right, that we're going to be looking at is the common iliac artery, right? So we have the abdominal aorta, right? As soon as we leave the abdominal aorta, as soon as we go down, there's going to be a bifurcation, right? So the abdominal aorta is going to turn into, let me just remove this. The abdominal aorta is going to turn into the common iliac artery, right? So abdominal aorta, click it right here, common iliac artery, right? We see that. So if I inspect abdominal aorta, common iliac artery, left and right. So if I do that again, right? If I move further down the common iliac artery, right? Common mean there's going to be some type of bifurcation or split as you move down the artery. If I go further down, I'm seeing the internal and the external iliac artery, right, on both sides, right? These are bilateral structures, right? So it's not quite clicking, but it is what it is. Let me just examine it here, right? So we see, right? So abdominal aorta, common iliac artery, external iliac artery, right? Internal iliac artery. So the internal iliac artery, the left and the right, that's going into the pelvis and perineum, whereas the external is going towards the anterior medial part of the thigh, right? And it's turning into the femoral artery. So we're going to show you that here. Let me move this because that's what it is, I'm pretty sure. Yep. So you can't have things open on the side when you're trying to do this. But that makes a little bit more sense, right? We can see that. So we see the abdominal aorta splitting to form the left and right common iliac arteries, which are then both splitting into the external and internal iliac arteries. Now that we have that down, let's move on to the renal artery. So move myself and examine. We have that, so I'm going to unselect all of these here, and we're going to move on to these other structures. Okay. So renal artery, right? Renal, kidney. Makes sense, right? So I'm going to move the hepatic portal system that I have here, right? So this is the hepatic portal system. I'm going to remove that so you can see the splenic artery clearly. But I could try to do it before, but I just want you guys to be able to see all of the vasculature in the abdominal cavity, right? It's a lot, right? But if you understand and spatially visualize and understand different things, it makes it a little bit simpler. So let me just do that, right? So I think I should be able to keep it actually. I just need to isolate certain things, but let's get that. Okay, let's press that. Okay, right. So right now I've just selected the kidneys, right, the renal arteries and the abdominal aorta, right. So renal, kidney, as I said before. Let me inspect that, right. So makes sense, right. So our renal arteries, they're directly next, right, to the kidneys, right, going to the kidneys, coming off the abdominal aorta. Now that we see that, I'm going to remove from inspect, examine, right, clear view. Now I'm going to move on to gonadal or testicular, right, or ovarian With this, I would definitely write gonadal every single time. I wouldn't write testicular or ovarian because those are harder words to spell than gonadal, Gonadal. Gonadal is a very easy word to spell, and if you get ovarian or testicular wrong in the spelling, it wouldn't really make sense since the gonadal is so easy to write. So these are our gonadal arteries right here. So right, left and right, bilateral structure, right, going to our gonads. Makes sense. Right, so you see it coming off the abdominal aorta, right, somewhat close to inferior mesenteric artery, right, and inferior to celiac trunk and superior mesenteric artery. Right. Now that we have that, right, so we've gone over all of the arterial structures that we need to go over. Now we're going to go over the venous structures. So let's move that. Let's move that. Let's move that. Now we're going to go into the veins, right? So the venous structures. So the first big structure we've seen before, inferior vena cava, right? Right. Inferior vena cava goes to the right atrium, right? Goes into the right atrium, right? And it, right, deposits the blood into the right atrium, and then that blood goes through the pulmonary circulation, and then eventually, as you leave the left ventricle, you're in the systemic circulation, right? We went over all of this already. But right, I just want to show you that this is our inferior vena cava. Okay. Now that we have our inferior vena cava, remember we just went over the arterial iliac, right? The arterial iliacs, right? So now the venous ones follow the same pattern, right? So inferior vena cava splits into common iliac veins, left and right. And then our common iliac veins split into our external and internal iliac veins, right? So the same thing. Like you see the veins and the arteries of the iliacs running right next to each other, right? Iliacs is just the way that I just kind of sum up the whole, right, vascular structure in that region, right? So like we have external iliac artery, external iliac vein. We have internal iliac vein, right? Internal iliac artery. Same thing here. We have internal iliac vein, internal iliac artery, right? So makes sense. Right, so we have them running with each other. So I'm gonna inspect. So we have inferior vena cava, common iliac vein, left and right. Then we have, which splits into the external and internal iliac veins. And I'm going to highlight the arteries as well, just to show you guys that they're literally running right next to each other. The arteries and the veins are running right next to each other. Okay. There we go. Pretty sure that is it. Yep. Okay. Right? Makes sense. They're running directly with each other. Okay. Now that we have that down, I want us to move on to the hepatic veins, hepatic portal veins, the splenic vein, inferior mesenteric vein, superior mesenteric vein. Right, so we have that all that down. I'm going to move on to the other structures here. So let me just unselect all these things. Let me select the IVC. It's already selected. Right, and then I'm just going to press the gonadal veins, right? So we went over the gonadal arteries, right? So gonadal artery, right? This is ovarian, of course, because this is a female 3D rendering. But, right, just worry about saying gonadal, please, I beg you guys. So with that being said, right, similar to the aorta, coming off of the IVC is the gonadal veins, right? So it's the right one's gonna be coming off the IVC, and the left one is gonna be coming off of the renal vein, right? So that's the renal vein right there. So I don't know if I showed you guys that, so let me just select that as well. So we'll just talk about that as well. Okay, so right here, right? Let me unselect the internal iliac artery. There we go, okay? Right, so we have our IVC, right? So inferior vena cava, which goes and splits into our renal veins, right? Similar to the aorta splitting into the renal arteries, right? Very similar. And then also coming off of the IVC is the right gonadal vein, right? And coming off the left renal vein is the left gonadal vein. Make sense, right? So coming off the IVC, right gonadal vein. Coming off the left renal vein, we have the gonadal vein, right? Left gonadal vein, right? So right gonadal vein, left gonadal vein, IVC, renal vein. Now we're gonna move on to the hepatic portal system, right? This is one thing that I want you guys to pay very close attention to. I'll go slow on this just to make sure we understand how this portal system is working, and that's why I do urge you guys to watch the pre-lab, right? Just to make sure you understand these things. Not watch the pre-lab, read. I don't know why I keep saying watch, read. But in saying that, I'm going to select all of the portions of the hepatic portal system, right? So we have our hepatic portal vein, superior mesenteric vein, inferior mesenteric vein, our splenic vein, right? So these are all the portions of the hepatic vein, all the portions of the hepatic portal system. So if I were to press this, remember our liver should be right here, right? So I can probably add our liver just so we can get a visual understanding of what's happening. If I move on to organs, hepatic organs, there we go. Let's put the liver in there, right? Okay, that's a little bit better. But the one thing that I do want you guys to understand before I even press liver is to just select the hepatic veins. Right? I want you to understand what's going on. Okay. Okay, now if I press the liver, I press examine, right? Okay, so we have our hepatic portal vein, right? So that's that vein right there, the hepatic portal vein. And then we have our splenic vein, right? This is our splenic vein going towards our spleen. Makes sense, right? Going towards our spleen, which is in this region. I can also press spleen just so we can see that. It's fine, no problem. But we know our spleen is in our general region. We've seen our spleen before. So we have our spleen right on the left side of the body in this region. So we see our splenic vein going towards that, right? Our spleen would be right here, right? That's where our spleen would be. And then we have our inferior mesenteric artery, and then we have our inferior mesenteric vein, right, and superior mesenteric vein, right? Not arteries. We're looking at a venous system right here, right? So superior mesenteric vein, inferior mesenteric vein. Then we have our hepatic portal vein, right? So once the blood is taken, right, through the hepatic portal vein from these three regions, right, it's going into the liver, right? The liver has a filtration system, right, that works as a defense, and it also takes out nutrients, right, that's coming from these different regions, right? So this hepatic portal system is so that if we ingest toxins or certain things come into our body that's not supposed to be there, our liver, right, acts as a defense mechanism against that, right? Our liver can be a defense system, right? Instead of all of that blood going straight back into the inferior vena cava, into the heart, and then pumping to the rest of the body, right? So that's what this hepatic portal system is. It's meant to serve as a boundary or a kind of barrier, right, to absorb nutrients coming from the body, right, coming from these organs, right, everything that we're eating, it's meant to absorb that nutrients, and it's also meant to be a secondary defense system, right? But also, we can move on to the hepatic veins, right? So we know our hepatic portal vein is right here, right? So hepatic portal vein, And then these would be our hepatic veins, right? So hepatic portal vein is draining into the liver, right? And then we have our hepatic portal veins that are draining into the IVC, right? So once that blood is filtered, we have we have that blood going directly back into the IVC via the hepatic veins, right? So hepatic portal veins are coming from inferior, superior mesenteric, and splenic, right, going into the hepatic portal vein, and then the hepatic portal vein is draining into the liver, and then our liver, right, doing all of those processes, and then that blood is draining back into the hepatic veins, which are going into the IVC. Right, so examine, right, we kind of see how that's working now, right? We see our hepatic veins draining to the IVC, we see our hepatic portal vein going into the liver. Make sense? All right. Now we're going to move on into our bile ducts and then go over that system. All right, guys, now we're going to move on to our bile ducts. So the first duct that we have is our common bile duct. Right, so if I move right to a little bit more of the inferior aspect of the liver, we're looking at the anterior. Ooh, this is not cooperating once. There we go. Okay. All right, so now we can see a little bit more. Right. So we have our common bile duct. And then again, common means there's going to be some type of bifurcation as we move down that artery, vein, nerve, right, or duct. And our common bile duct splits into our cystic duct. So our cystic duct would be going to the gallbladder, right? So cystic duct going to the gallbladder. And then we have also our common hepatic duct, right? So common hepatic duct. Right, again, common, it makes sense. It splits into some type of splits into some type of structure as we move down, right, to that artery, vein, duct, nerve, etc. Right, so now if I inspect and examine as well, right, we see the common bile duct splitting into the cystic duct, and then that splits into the common hepatic duct. Right, makes sense. And also, I want to show you guys something with the pancreas as well, right? Right, so I just want to show you that bile, right? Bile is being inserted into the duodenum, right? You see that? Right, we see our common bile duct, right? Going all the way to the duodenum, right? We can't really see that in lab, but you can see that here. Going all the way to the duodenum. If I were to, yeah, right? Makes sense. Pancreas and duodenum. All right. So we see our bile duct, right? A common bile duct literally going through the duodenum. Now we're going to move on to the nerves. All right, now we're going to be going over some nerve structures, starting with the splenic nerves located in the thorax, right? So, right, we're still looking in the abdomen mostly, but the thorax would be right above it, right here, right? So coming from, right, let me just highlight that 1 second, just so we can see it clearly. So coming from the sympathetic trunk and the thoracic cavity, we have the splenic nerves. Right, so this would be the splenic nerves. If I were to examine, right here, right. Ooh, press that by accident. Right, so that would be our splenic nerves there in the back. I can't really, whatever. Yeah, there we go. All right, so those would be our splenic nerves there in the back. If I were to just inspect, right. These would be our thoracic, sympathetic trunk, splenic nerves, right? Because they're coming from the thoracic sympathetic trunk. Right, so you'll see those in the posterior region, right, of the thorax, right, right on the lateral side of the vertebra, right. You'll you'll see the sympathetic trunk coming all the way down on the lateral side, and then you'll see the splanchnic nerve, right, the greater splanchnic nerve most likely coming from the sympathetic trunk. Right, so I just wanted to show you guys that, right, and then also I'm going to highlight the sympathetic trunk and the sympathetic ganglia on both sides, right, bilateral structure. Same, okay, there we go. Now if I examine these, right, you see that. You see the sympathetic trunk on the lateral side of the vertebra, we see the vertebral body right here, and then we see, right, sympathetic trunk. All right, now we're going to move into the renal structures, right? First structure being the suprarenal gland, right? Suprarenal gland, supra meaning above, renal, kidney, gland, right? It secretes. So let me just remove the lymph, and then so we have the suprarenal gland right on top of the kidneys, right? So left, right on top of the kidneys. So if I were to isolate these, right, suprarenal glands right on top of the kidneys. Now we're gonna look at the actual kidney structures. But before we do that, I just want to mention the ureter, right, and the left. Well, they classify this as the renal pelvis. So pelvis, renal pelvis, left and right, and then we have a ureter, right and left, coming all the way down to the urinary bladder. Okay, so I'm going to inspect that, right? So we have suprarenal glands right on top of the kidneys. Then we have our ureters, our renal pelvis, turning into our ureter, left and right. Now we're going to look at these structures inside of the kidneys. So if I go here, let me look for the best one. I think this is the best one that we're going to be able to see. Okay. Alright. Okay. On the anterior. So we know our renal pelvis, right? So we're going to start with the renal cortex. So the renal cortex would be this outside layer, right? So this renal cortex would be this outside layer, right? Most superficial layer, right? Or the most outside layer, renal cortex, right around the pyramids, right around the medulla, right? Renal cortex. A renal pyramid, right, would be one individual pyramid, right? So if I remove that, right, let's say that's the cortex, right? Right, if I remove the outside cortex, right, we have our pyramid, right? So one of these pyramids, right, if I were to just select one of these, that would be a renal pyramid. If I were to select all of them, that would be the renal medulla. So let me just get this back, right? Right, so if I were to select all of these, right, so if I just remove this, right, that would be the renal medulla, right? So if all of these are selected, renal medulla. If one individual one is selected, like I have here, that would be renal pyramid, right? So also, right, in this structure here, right, in this little invisible region here, right, that would just be the outside of the kidney. But I'm trying to get you to understand, if this was severed in half, right, if this was bisected, right, you would see the renal pyramids, right, or renal medulla being multiple, and then you would see the outside cortex here, right? So I'm just trying to have you guys orient yourself, right? This would be the whole kidney, right? We're just able to see the structures on the inside. But if I were to bisect this, right, and look on the inside, you would see the cortex right on the outside edge, right? And then in between the actual renal pyramids, right, we have our renal columns, right? So if I were to bisect this, right, in between these pyramids would be the renal columns, right? Right? Renal columns would be in between these pyramids. Now let's move on to the major and the minor calyces, right? So if I were to remove the kidney here, if if I were to remove this structure here, so if I remove all the pyramids, right, now we're looking at the minor, right, the minor calyx, right, or the minor calyces. So all of those are the minor calyces, right? You see how all of the minor calyces in the kidney, they're all draining into the major, right? So minor, you see a bunch of minors draining into the major, right? Right, so minor, right? See all the minor ones, and then they're draining into the major, right? So, right, you see? So if I remove the major, right, right? So all of the minor ones are draining into the major, right? So these are the major calyces, minor calyces, right? And then those are draining into the renal pelvis, right? And now the renal pelvis, right? Now at this point you have urine, right, which is going to the ureter and going all the way to the urinary bladder, right? Just kind of wanted to break that down so we understand how the kidneys actually look like. So now that we have that, that's basically everything. We just have two more structures to look at, being the posterior abdominal wall muscles. So if I go to this structure here, or if I go to the abdomen deep layers, let's just remove our kidneys for the sake of being able to see these structures, right? I think that's good enough. Right, so we see quadratus, right? Quad 4, lumborum, right? We're in the lumbar region, right? So we go from cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, right? Right? And coccyx, right? So, being that we have quadratus lumborum, right? Quad 4, lumborum, lumbar region, right? So again, these names match the either function or positioning anatomically. Quadratus lumborum. And then we also have psoas major, right? Right, psoas major. Then we have psoas minor right on top of psoas major, right? But in the lab, you can't really see psoas minor for most of the donors, so I would worry mostly about psoas major more than minor. But you can also see psoas minor in one of the donors, I think. But your TA can confirm that. So if I just inspect here, right, we see quadratus lumborum all the way in the back. Then we see psoas major and then psoas minor, right? So psoas major, right, these two right here, and then psoas minor, right? So if I were to go back, examine, right, you see quadratus lumborum in the back, we see psoas major, and then we see psoas minor, right on top of major. All right, that's the content for this week. I hope you guys enjoyed, and have a good rest of your week, guys.